Well, over the past few weeks, we've been asking for your questions for the bottom line. You delivered, and now guess who's on the hot seat? Patty Croft is an economic analyst and former senior banker. Jim Stanford is an economist with Unifor. Preet Banerjee is a personal finance writer and broadcaster. And Amanda Lang is our senior business correspondent. So let's get right to it with the first question. Came in by video. Here it is.
Is something fundamentally unfair about rock bottom interest rates? Savers are pushed toward unwise risks to get adequate income, while companies get very cheap money compared to the returns they can earn.
Now, I like Neil's question. It's a really good question. Is there, though, something fundamentally unfair about this?
Well, Peter, I don't think I'd use the word unfair, but I would use the word distorted, because when you have long periods of low interest rates, it distorts things. So prices for housing, stocks, and bonds go way up, interest rates go way down, and that penalizes savers. So he does have a point. But I have an option as well. A safe place to put your money, for example, is in the big banks. The average dividend yield for the 5 big banks is 4.2%. Now, he may think that's a risky investment. I don't, but that's a good rate of return for a relatively safe investment.
Jim.
It is a quandary. Of course, we need the low interest rates to stimulate more spending by consumers, companies. And more recently, a big benefit of low rates has been bringing the Canadian dollar back down to stimulate our exports. But when they're in place for so long, as we've seen, you do get some unintended consequences on saving. Pension funds, for example, have a really hard time in a low interest rate environment. So there are limits to what low rates can do. We need other forms of stimulus spending, public and private investment to get things rolling, not just low interest rates.
But you wouldn't go as far as saying it's fundamentally unfair.
Well, I mean, what is an interest payment anyway? It's giving you money because you had money. So, you know, obviously you do want an incentive for some savings, but I don't consider high interest rates fair either. It's just a macroeconomic variable that is going to rise or fall over time.
Preet.
Yeah, it's interesting. Wearing my personal finance hat, a lot of people go back to the early 80s and say, listen, interest rates were so much higher, incentivized savings, but inflation was also much higher back then. So when you take a look at an inflation-adjusted after-tax return, it's not that much better than it used to be, or not that much worse today. And what I would say is it always makes sense to save money. So you should always have money left over at the end of the month. And maybe the split with what you do with that savings might go further into longer-term investments, like maybe bank stocks or something else, but you should always save money, full stop.
I think where this gets important is the duration at which we've had rates so low. We knew that it had to happen. It was an emergency. It was a bit like calling the fire department when your house is on fire. You're not going to quibble about it. Then you're left with a really wet, muggy house. It's gone on so long that I think you do start to get into a little bit of injustice, because there are participants in the world, and they tend to be wealthy, who benefit from these asset bubbles, who can afford to play in them. And then the participants who aren't wealthy, who can't, who rely on fixed income products and their savings, and they are suffering. So to me, it actually starts to raise the policy question of when do you start getting us out of this stimulus situation?
All right. Let's move on with the questions. There are a lot of questions, not surprisingly, about houses. Here's one from Muftaz Munaz in Toronto. I'm looking to purchase my first property. I have very good credit and no debt. Only downside is I don't have a down payment. With the recent interest changes in the market, will this be a good time to buy in with a 0% down payment? In other words, no money for a down payment.
No money down payment. Well, if you look at mortgage rates, it's a fabulous time. We've got 5-year fixed and variable rates below 3%, which is absolutely incredible. But to buy with a 0 down payment, not such a good idea. You can do it in Canada, but the rules are that if you have less than 20%, that mortgage has to be insured by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corp or Genworth in the private sector. But that's going to cost you money. It'll cost you up to 3% of the value of your mortgage, and that gets rolled into your monthly payments. So yes, you can borrow with 0 down payment, but it's going to be expensive. And there are rules. Both CMHC and Genworth say that your total housing-related expenses can't be more than 32% of your gross income. So I doubt that if you're buying a house in Toronto with a 0 down payment, you're going to qualify. But good luck with that one.
We should also point out that CMHC requires a minimum of 5% down these days. So you couldn't even get a 0 down mortgage unless you borrowed your down payment, which some people are offering to do to people. And this is just a horrible, horrible idea.
Okay, so there's really no such thing as a 0 down payment.
No.
Really, anyway, you're paying somewhere along the line on something.
Even if it's mom and dad, you're paying somebody.
Right. Okay. Stephen Sartori from Montreal writes, cutting interest rates for short-term gain to combat the effects of falling oil prices almost guarantees a future housing bubble that will eventually burst. Man, how many times have we talked about housing bubble? How would one prepare and even profit from this other than selling one's residence? Amanda.
Well, I take it in two parts. One is nothing guarantees a housing bubble. As you say, we've been discussing whether we have one or not. But let's assume that lower rates do send asset prices up, which I guess we think they do. I think the question of how one profits from it is an important one, and the answer is you don't. Trying to play these markets is very dangerous. I've thought for years that if you're sitting on a house that you've made a lot of money on and it suits your lifestyle and your needs to take that money out, it's not a bad thing to do when the market is considered fully valued. But you shouldn't buy and sell things trying to play the timing, because one thing we know is we get that wrong.
All right, Jim, this one's for you. It comes from Jonathan Edwin in Toronto. I am a young professional looking to enter the housing market in the next year. Despite lower interest rates on mortgages, I'm concerned about a market correction and drop in the value in any property I purchase. How will the recent drop in interest rates affect my plans?
Well, it kind of ties into the previous question that Amanda answered, and I agree with Amanda. I think you really should view your house as a place to live first and foremost, and not really as a financial investment. So certainly, lower interest rates are going to allow this viewer and any other home buyer to pay more for their property and still afford the monthly payment, and that is going to drive up housing prices. So, you know, if you should look at it, if you can afford to do it and you have the down payment, as we just talked about, you should check that you can afford the interest payments, even if the rates go up. Sooner or later, they will go up. So you should know that you can afford your mortgage, even if rates go back up to 5 or even 6%. Then, by all means, buy a house and enjoy it as a place to live, but don't see it as an investment. The one caution I'd add is if you're in one of the markets regionally that's most likely to see some downside. That would be Alberta right now, where oil prices have fallen and housing prices are already falling. Toronto and Vancouver are the two most overvalued parts of the housing market. Be cautious.
I know that because you've been telling us that, as all of you have for 5 years now.
Yeah. Those might be places you want to rent and think about buying somewhere down the line.
All right, Preet, here's a housing one for you. It came in on Twitter. Hearing for a long time now that Canadian housing market is way overpriced. If yes, and this is the question, why has it sustained it so long?
A couple of factors: access to credit and the ability of people to make their monthly commitments. The delinquency rate on mortgages is quite low, but certainly a lot of people, even around the world now, have been saying Canadian housing is overvalued. Even the governor of the Bank of Canada late last year said, oh yeah, it's overvalued. And by
even
30%.
the bottom line panel on CBC said
For a
it was
long time.
overvalued.
For 5 years.
And so he said, well, you know what, that doesn't mean there's necessarily going to be a 30% correction, barring any shocks to the system. And I think we're going to test that hypothesis in Alberta, because there's been a shock to the system in Alberta, and we've seen the rate of sales of homes has dropped off a cliff. Remains to be seen if prices are going to follow, but that is going to see, we're going to test that hypothesis.
I heard an interesting theory today over breakfast that this fellow who's big in the kind of real estate and commercial real estate market especially, said to me that one of the reasons is that after 2008, people got scared of paper assets. They wanted real, they wanted to be able to see something. Everybody from, you know, cab drivers to big business people wanted to see where their money was, and that's why they're sunk it in property.
Yeah, there's also a generational perspective. There's a whole generation of potential first-time home buyers who don't know that sometimes housing goes down in value, and they've grown up in a very low interest rate environment. And it reminds me of those Saturday morning cartoons when the coyote's tracing the roadrunner off a cliff and they're suspended there until someone hands them a book on gravity, they read it and then they fall. I think a lot of young homers may not realize that, you know, the housing market sometimes goes down.
Those were the best cartoons. All right, from Saskatoon, Wayne Iyer writes, and Patty, this one's for you. Given that OPEC's oversupply of oil, we're shifting to oil questions now, there were a lot of those as well, the oversupply of oil is impacting government revenues and lowering employment levels in Canada. Should we not simply stop importing OPEC oil and rely on our own oil resources?
It sounds like a great idea in theory, but I think in reality, unfortunately, it's not going to work. But the reason why we're still importing oil from OPEC and others into Eastern Canada is because we don't have a pipeline from west to east. There are proposals on the table, but they're very controversial. But let's just say that we were able to stop importing from OPEC. It still would not insulate us from the vagaries of the ups and downs of oil prices. And that's because Canada is a net energy exporter. So the fact of the matter is we don't set the price in Canada. We are price takers. The price is set outside of Canada. So even if we were energy self-sufficient, we're still exporting oil. Oil goes down 50%. It's still going to affect government revenues and Canadian jobs, unfortunately.
Amanda, you want to add to that?
Well, the only thing is I looked at this question and I thought, it seems quaint, except that it's what the President of the United States says, too. Let's just keep it all here at home and we'll consume our own stuff. I think Patty's absolutely right. It's a global market, and low prices are good for consumers. So the price does fall. We have to remember that there's a whole swath of our economy and the globe that's benefiting from a weaker price of oil.
All right. This one's from Ottawa, from Jean-Louis Lamontagne. Why not build a refinery and sell finished product rather than our raw material? We would create jobs and enhance our economy. Now, we have some refineries, but it's true that the pipelines, they're shifting oil and want to shift oil to the U.S. That's the raw product. Why not refine it here, Jim?
I think the viewer's right on, Peter. I say, why not refine it here? We absolutely should refine it here. We'd add value to the resource before we sell it, whether to Canadian consumers or to export. We get more jobs, more productivity, more income out of it. We'd also stabilize the roller coaster a bit. I mean, Patty just mentioned, even if we were only using our own oil, we're still on that roller coaster. But by doing more upgrading and refining and value added, the reality is, gasoline prices never fall as much as oil does. You've probably noticed that at the pump. So by diversifying and including the value-added end of things in your economy, you're actually protecting yourself a bit from that roller coaster.
I'm curious to know who we is. Who are we that's going to refine?
Jim, in the last 30 years in Canada, there's only been one new refinery built and 5 have been closed.
Yes.
So who's going to build this refinery?
And it's a national failure, I think, that even since 2002, when the oil boom really took off, our amount of refining and upgrading that we do in Canada has actually declined. So we're extracting more. It's a kind of a strip and ship mentality. And in the long run, you can't build a country that way. So we have to invest in refineries, perhaps some new ones, but also upgrading the ones that we have to make sure that they do stay in business. We've got to put in place the infrastructure so that we get our raw feedstock to our refineries. And we're going to need some kind of an incentive to make sure.
I think the numbers just don't work.
Well, I think
the question
is the Stanford refinery
Stanford
system,
refinery.
Right?
I think the question.
You have a quick word on this?
Yeah, I think the question as to why not has been answered by private corporations who've tried to build a business case and they say it doesn't make sense. But to add to the issue of what it would do to the economy, people already said that the exposure of energy in the economy is big as it is. So if we expanded it, then the highs would be higher and the lows would be lower. So it would be more volatile.
All right, I got to take a break, but I want to squeeze this one in. Patty, it'll be for you. Byron Barwick from Toronto writes, in a worst-case scenario, is there even a remote possibility that if the oil price drop escalates to a real crisis, some say it already is, that it could impact upon seniors' OAS and CPP benefits?
Such a great question, and to me it just speaks to how concerned people are about how secure are their benefits in retirement. But the answer to that question to me is absolutely not, because I think the link is through oil prices and the CPPIB. That's the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board that's responsible for managing the Canada Pension Plan. So that's $240 billion worth of assets. Are they exposed to oil and realizing losses? Absolutely. But it's such a diverse asset allocation strategy that any losses energy-related are being offset by gains in other sectors like utilities and telecom that are doing very well.
All right.
So I think the answer is no.
Okay, got to take that break. Time for a quick one. But we'll have more of your questions for the bottom line when we come back. And welcome back to our special Your Questions edition of The Bottom Line. Patty, Jim, Preet, and Amanda are all here. Your questions. Let's try and get as many in this final section as we can, starting with Sue Rickards from Lower Queensbury, New Brunswick. Why don't economists and bankers seem to recognize that agriculture will be a major Canadian resource and revenue generator in the future? Our wealth may be in the ground, but we're digging in the wrong place for it. Amanda.
Well, I love this question because I think a lot of Canadians don't realize how important agriculture is, how big it is, how world-class it is, and in fact, it's the biggest sector of our economy. I think economists and bankers do recognize it. The government may not. If we think of policies that could generate growth and future jobs and innovation, we could probably do more. Now, the trade-off might be fewer family farms and more kind of corporate work. That's a trade-off that you may have to live with. But at the moment, I think it's an absolutely bridliant question because it's an untapped resource for us.
And family farms have disappeared so much already over the last
They really
generation. Gord Pizer from Kenora, Ontario. That's a good one. The U.S. economy is now performing well, but it is to a large degree a result of quantitative easing. Remember that? Quantitative easing, the printing of money by a central bank to stimulate the economy. That's a very basic
You
way
could
of
be an
putting it.
economist,
I
Peter.
could.
You did that
In
very
fact,
well.
I now am. So what happens when the Fed stops purchasing and starts selling hundreds and billions of dollars of bonds and assets? Aren't we back at square one, Patty?
The answer is no. But if we look at quantitative easing, the U.S. went big and they went bold. So they did buy trillions of dollars worth of debt. The balance sheet of the Federal Reserve stands at $4.5 trillion, a very big number. But they're not going to sell that debt tomorrow. If anything, they're going to hang on to it and allow a lot of it to actually expire and mature. So don't worry about them selling it and that having an impact. Did it work? Are we back to square one? We're not back to square one. It worked magnificently. The reason why the U.S. economy is leading the world is because quantitative easing was a cornerstone of policy. I
think you all picked it, or some version of it, as one of the surprises of the last year when we talked around the turn of the year. All right, last question. And Preet and Jim will get a run at this one. Sylvia Arbo from Edmonton writes, isn't it time for a serious conversation about free university and other post-secondary education for Canadian youth in Canadian institutions? I can hear the cheering across the land. After all, would this not be an investment that would pay dividends to the whole country? Preet.
Well, it's not without precedent. There are many universities in Europe that offer free tuition. And the overarching theory is that the upfront societal cost is more than made up for larger lifetime incomes of all these graduates. The question is, would it work in Canada? And if you implemented free tuition, you would have possibly a flood of graduates with all these skills competing for the same jobs. So at the same token, you probably have lower starting income. So it's definitely a conversation worth having if we get to a point where we have a surplus and we're fighting over ways to how to spend it, but probably no decision anytime soon.
You gonna fess up now?
Yes, I would very much like low tuition because I went back to school recently and I've got 5 more years of tuition to pay.
All right, you get the final word, Jim.
The spirit behind the question is also very valid. This is exactly the time to invest in our public programs, invest in our people, invest in our skills. And in many cases, including this one, they really do pay off economically and fiscally. Another good one I really like is universal early childhood education. Economists have looked very closely at this, and the GDP gains and the taxes that result from more women being in the paid labor force more than pay for the cost of the program. So at a time when the private sector is kind of slowing down, this is exactly the time to expand public programs like that one.
All right, good conversation and great questions. Thank you for your patience with the answers. Thank you as well for those questions. The bottom line will be back in about a month's time.